Good morning, everyone. We are very happy to host Bruno Olshausen today. Thank you very much for joining. I am Pratik Chaudhary. Kostas Danidis and I are the faculty hosts for today's seminar. A quick reminder, the Zoom recordings of past videos are available on YouTube. You're welcome to watch them. Today's seminar will be anchored by Rahul Ramesh, who is in the 6th year in the computer science program. He's working on self-supervised learning for visual tasks. And Anthony Bisulco, who is in the 5th year, I think, or 4th year of the computer science program. And he's working on mask autoencoders. Let me introduce our speaker, Bruno. He's a professor of neuroscience and optometry at the University of Berkeley. He is also the director of the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, which focuses on mathematical and computational work, computational models of brain. Before he came to Berkeley, he did his undergraduate work at Stanford and his PhD at Caltech. And he was a professor at UC Davis in psychology and neurobiology. Many of us have known his results over the years. We have spent a lot of time studying them. His postdoctoral work was with David Field at Cornell, where they built sparse coding hypothesis or sparse coding as a way of explaining the representations that are learned in the visual cortex. And this is a very beautiful mathematical link between the statistics of natural scenes and the representations that we record in certain parts of the brain. His current research aims to understand the information processing strategies employed by the brain for doing tasks such as recognition, scene analysis, navigation, which is what he'll talk to us today about, invariance and equivariance in brains and machines. Please, very well, happy to have you.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, thanks. It's great to be here. It's really an honor to be here. And I look forward to meeting with many of you today. And I'll begin with let's see. Okay, I'll just begin with introducing the group I work with at Berkeley, which is in the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. Basically, we're a group of faculty and students and postdocs with backgrounds in many different fields, from engineering and physics, and also neuroscience, and psychology and vision science. And we're trying to bring the ideas from these different fields together to understand how brains work, how brains compute. And I'll use this slide to introduce the various people who have contributed to the work I'll be talking about today. First of all, don't be alarmed. We haven't recruited Conrad Korting to Berkeley yet, but he happened to be visiting the day that we took our group photo. And so I thought we would just have him add some color to the picture, as he often does. So so Sophia Sanborn and Christian Shoemake were really instrumental in introducing and sort of spearheading this approach in my lab now, using Lie groups to mathematically model transformations in images. And so that's sort of behind a lot of the work I'll be telling you about today. And they also helped me apply for a grant to NSF to fund this project, together with Nina Miolaine and Stella Yu, who's now at University of Michigan. And so that's supporting a lot of this work. Fritz Sommer, who's I'm sorry, he is not labeled here, but Fritz Sommer, who's another PI in the Redwood Center, who I work with a lot, was very instrumental in developing a lot of these ideas. And Chris Kim over here, Chris Kim is the student who developed this model of residue number systems, which I'll be talking about. And that was also together with Pentti Kanerva, who's also very important in pioneering this idea of computing with high-dimensional vectors. And that's really behind a lot of the work that I'll be telling you about today. So I guess I would say, from a very high-level point of view, or broadly speaking, this talk is about two things. It's about the question of how do brains work, and how do we build machines that work like brains. And so, given that, it's I think useful to look back at other efforts where people tried to build machines that work something like biology or get their ideas from biology. And a good example of that is the development of flight, which took place around the turn of the last century. And at that time, prior to the Wright brothers, many people understood the principle of lift in wings, and they could build gliders. And people like Otto Lilienthal, he was very much not just inspired, but really basing his designs off of the design of bird wings and so forth, and was successful at building gliders that could, you could jump off a hill and you could glide down on a straight path. But the one thing that they could not do, that everybody was really trying to do it, and which the Wright brothers solved, was they didn't know how to turn. They couldn't control the plane in flight. They could just sort of get into the air, but the minute they tried to turn this aircraft, it would just simply fall out of the sky. And this led to a lot of accidents, and actually, but it's what killed Lilienthal. And so, but the way the Wright brothers solved this problem is by watching how birds fly. They spent a lot of their time watching birds in flight. And one of the things they noticed is that when they turn, they also twist their wings at the same time. They twist one, the wing sort of pointing down, I forget which way up, I think, and then the other wing, they twist in the opposite direction as they turn. And they reasoned that what this does when they twist their wings is it sort of produces more force at the end where they're sort of banking and prevents them from falling out of the sky. And so they tested this idea in a simple kite that they built. They could do this, and that seemed to work. They implemented it, they incorporated it in the airplane, and that was really behind the success of what enabled them to control flight and turn the airplane successfully. So it's a beautiful example of where, in building a machine, we took inspiration, not just inspiration, but we actually adopted a design principle from biology, and we learned something about this design principle at the same time. Because prior to that, people didn't really know, well, why do birds twist their wings when they fly? And now we knew. They could figure that out. And through this process of testing that theory in building their plane. What enabled them to make this link was the fact that they were solving the same problem that biology was solving. They were confronted with the same fundamental problem, and somehow evolution surmounted this problem and figured out a solution. And since they were solving that exact same problem, they were able to gain insight by looking at biology's solution. And so since there's a lot of talk today about this interface between artificial intelligence and neuroscience, and it seems very reasonable that each of these fields has a lot to potentially teach each other, there's also reasons to kind of say, well, it's not quite clear that they're doing the same thing. So on the right is what biology built. So this is one of many things that biology built 500 million years ago, which was the jumping spider. And the jumping spider is really a fantastic animal for studying vision. They have 8 eyes. These 2 forward-looking eyes, these have very large lenses. This is just a cross-section, not a cross-section, but a sort of visualization of the eyes inside the head. These 2 eyes, in the centrally mounted, they have very high resolution vision. The retina is at the back of these long tubes, and the retina, in fact, is just a one-dimensional strip of photoreceptors. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not shown here. Okay, retina is just a one-dimensional strip of photoreceptors that they scan back and forth by moving these tubes inside their head. And you can see that in this video up here. For this, when a jumping spider is very young, the exoskeleton is translucent, so you can see these tubes moving back and forth inside the head. It's also a beautiful example of active vision, which Vuchanna was really an early pioneer together with Yannis Olimonos, and sort of illustrating these principles. This is how vision began. It sort of feels foreign to us, the fact that you have all these different eyes and it's sort of moving around and scanning the world in this way. But this is how vision began. It's very much a part of how we do vision too. But also what's remarkable about this is that it's doing so much. And so in a second, it can solve 3D mazes. It does these amazing courtship dances that it uses vision for. So it has a very sophisticated visual capability in terms of being able to perceive the 3D world and recognize patterns. It can recognize other conspecifics and so forth and distinguish them from prey. Okay, and it's doing this all at a very small form factor and a very low energy budget. Okay, so that's what biology did. This is what artificial intelligence is doing. And well, of course, this is right here, I'm just visualizing the NERSC supercomputer at UC Berkeley, which is one of my favorite targets, which consumes 5 megawatts of power. And this is really sort of representative of many of the platforms that AI is running its algorithms on today. And here in Pennsylvania, as I'm sure you know, they're talking about rebooting Three Mile Island nuclear power plant to power these GPU servers to power AI. Okay, so this is what we're currently building in artificial intelligence. And it seems like they're basically solving very different problems. The problem that biology solved was, how do you take all this ability to do intelligence and cram it into a very small space such that it consumes a small amount of energy? And that's a necessary part of making a system autonomous, so it can move around in the world without a power cable attached to it, without internet or something like that, that all the computation is on board. So it's a very necessary part of the design. One of the problems that then biology had to grapple with is that of designing the algorithm at the same time as considering the physics of computation, or in this case, the biophysics of computation. These things are intimately intertwined, okay? Whereas the model on the left, those things are separate almost by design, okay? We don't think about the physics of the computation that much when we design the algorithm, okay? So one argument is that what biology spent a lot of time in is this idea of co-design, of developing the algorithm in a way that was intimately intertwined with the physics of computation. And so that approach is really a lot of what's behind here. That's going to lead you to a different way of thinking about the problems, a different type of algorithm, thinking about how it's going to be implemented in neural circuitry and be enabled at such low power budgets. Okay, I'm sorry. Here's the one-dimensional retina I showed before. There's one-dimensional strip of photoreceptors, and so it's basically scanning that back and forth inside the head to sort of build up an image of the world. Okay, so let's just take a look at some of these things that animals can do with their brains. And this is, again, the jumping spider, and one of the things they noticed of their behavior in the wild is that when they see a prey item they want to catch, normally they jump at it to capture it. But if it's too far away to jump at, then they have to walk to it through some other path. Okay, so they're good at finding a path. And as they're walking along towards the prey item, they notice that they sort of take these turns. They sort of turn their head toward the object as though to check, is it still there? And so they tested this idea in the lab in a controlled setting where they have the jumping spider walking down this one-dimensional track and a prey item somewhere in this ring around here. So they could look at the angle that initially looks at to see the prey item out here. And as then it walks down the track, there's walls in the track that occlude its vision, so it can't see it as it walks. And then partway along, and then it turns to check, is it still there? And they could look at the angle that it turns at and compare that to the angle that it should be, given the new angle with respect to the animal. And this is what that's showing here in the scatter plot. And you can see there's a very good agreement, right? So it's as though the jumping spider, so it knew all along where this target, where this goal was in the world with respect to its own position in the world in its new position, as though it's maintaining some internal representation of a goal or something in the external environment with respect to it. And for a long time, that seemed kind of surprising to people, maybe implausible. But now we can see it's definitely not implausible. This is a really a striking and amazing finding from Janile Farm, from Vivek Jayaraman's lab, where looking in the fruit fly brain, the fruit flies also need to know where they're going. And so deep inside the fruit fly brain, this is just showing some of the anatomy here. These are the optic lobes, which are getting the visual information from their compound eye, a very different eye than the jumping spider. But deep inside the brain here, deep inside the central brain is this thing called the central complex. And one of the elements or nuclei within the central complex is this ring of neurons called the ellipsoid body. So it's just literally a set of neurons connected in sort of a ring topology, anatomically organized in a ring like this. So they were able to image the activity of the neurons in this ring using 2-photon calcium imaging, and that's what's being shown here. It's just looking at the activity of the neurons in that ring, so that's sort of a heat map of their activity as the fly is walking along this ball in a kind of virtual reality environment. Okay, so it's tethered, and because they're recording from its brain, but it can walk along this ball and sort of walk in different directions. And what this is showing here is that you can basically decode the fly's own model of where it thinks it's heading, which direction it's heading, and compare it against the actual heading of the fly, and that's the other trace. And these basically, the thing that this is showing is that those two are just right on top of each other. Okay. Looks like they're not changing, but eventually goes down. So as you saw before, I think it sort of moves around, right? So it's really remarkable that the fly is maintaining this internal representation, somehow builds this representation of its heading with respect to an allocentric reference frame. It does not have any sensors. It's not like it's using submagnetic sense to do this. There is no sensor that tells it heading. The only way it can know that is by combining many sources of sensory information, some from the visual system. So there's lots of visual inputs we see anatomically into this ellipsoid body. And by the way, another really striking development is that now the full connectome of the fly is known, all 300,000 neurons, and how they interconnect with each other. The wiring diagram is fully now mapped out in the fly. And so it's a really amazing thing now, that the capability that people have to figure out this. And Larry Abbott and many others have looked at the theory of and mapped theories of computation onto this system very quantitatively. Okay, so there is no sensor for heading. And so it has to somehow combine all this sensory information in addition to motor information about, how it's moving, and integrate all this to assemble one unified representation of its heading with respect to the external world. Okay, so it's somehow doing this in a very small form factor with very few neurons, consuming very little energy. And so whereas it's building some internal representation of, heading in space, we're, sort of makes you speculate, well, do we have sort of rings of neuron in our brains that are doing that? No one has found them. We do have head direction cells. So mammalian cortex, you find these cells that signal heading direction. But we also perceive aspects of three-dimensional motion and self-motion, but also when we look at a display like this of moving dots, just sort of random dots attached to a cube, if they're static, you don't see anything. But once it moves, you see this very striking figure of a rigid three-dimensional cube. But at the same time, you perceive its axis of rotation in 3 dimensions. Okay, so that begs the question, well, where is this being done in the brain? No one really knows exactly where the neural correlate of that is. So there's some hints that might be somewhere in the parietal cortex. But somehow, evidently, there's very vivid perception here. You're perceiving 2 things. Okay, one is the axis, the 3-dimensional axis of rotation, which is basically an element of the SO3 group. And the other is the shape of the cube. And this is, and the remarkable thing is that, there is no cube there. There is no 3D axis of rotation. This is all there is. So what we did here is just take those same dots and randomize their positions. So it's the same motion, just to kind of see, this is basically the information you're building that percept out of. So it's something we're very good at, is taking motion like this, 2-dimensional motion, and then factorizing out of this 2-dimensional motion, factorizing out one representation, an axis of 3D rotation, and the other is the 3D shape of the object. Okay, and so another sort of example of this in human perception is done at the level of the retina. It's not done in the retina probably, but the problem starts in the retina, is that when you look at a shape in the world, when you look at something with your eyes, and even when you fixate it, your eye is still moving. So what's being visualized here is the cone array in the back of your retina. So each of these dots is a different photoreceptor, or a different pixel, if you will, in your retina. And each of those cones has a different wavelength selectivity for long, medium, and short wavelengths. And that's being visualized here in terms of red, green, and blue dots, okay? And so even when you stare at a letter, so when you're reading those letters on the lowest row of the Snellen eye chart that you can read with 20/20 vision, those letters only subtend a few cones on the retina. That's basically what it looks like. So an E here just facing up, and this is just showing what it looks like on the retina as you fixate. So even though you think you're holding your eyes still, the retina is still moving. Okay, so the question is, how do you take this time-varying array of activity and somehow out of that, you pull out of a shape? You don't see it moving, but somehow, presumably, your visual cortex has to be able to discount the motion and factorize apart the motion from the shape in order to be able to see it. Okay, so it looks stable to you and you can perceive its shape, even though it's always landing on different cones. And you can also perceive its color. Okay, even though at any given time, it's landing on a different set of cones in this mosaic, attuned to different wavelengths. Okay, so it's another a remarkable example of a problem that we're solving in perception, this idea of factorizing. In all these cases that I've been talking about, what the system must be doing is somehow taking raw sensory information and factorizing it into its underlying causes, which is typically some combination of a transformation, either due to self-motion or the object motion, and some kind of a shape, whether it be the layout of the environment or the shape of an object you're looking at, or something like that. Okay, so that's the basic problem I'm going to try to push here as a potential solution to that problem. And especially we're trying to think about how this could be solved efficiently in neural circuits. Okay, so these are the two problems we're going to try to answer. One is, how do we build equivariant representations of these transformations? And how do we also factorize out of that the invariant part, so the shape of an object or the layout of the world or something like that, which is, again, maybe, in the robotics community, we call this SLAM, of being able to simultaneously localize your position and build a map of the world at the same time from some sensory data, okay? And so these are basically two sides of the same coin, each of these problems. To get each of these, to understand the equivariance of the transformation, we have to be able to somehow model the shape. And in order to model the shape, we have to be able to discount or factorize apart the transformation from the raw sensory data. So we're going to talk about some theories for how a brain might compute these things and how we solve these kinds of factorization problems inside the brain in neural circuits. But before launching into that, I just want to make sort of maybe one comment, which is that we need to set aside perceptrons. All right, so we're all used to seeing perceptron models and all these neural network models, and I'm not going to be showing you models of perceptrons for a couple of reasons, because they don't have the necessary sort of computational primitives that we need, but also because that's not how brains work. Okay, so if there's anything that we've learned in more than a half century of neuroscience, is that neurons do not simply compute a weighted sum of inputs and apply a threshold to that. They do a much richer form of computation where they typically combine signals nonlinearly in the dendritic tree, and sometimes even sort of pseudo-multiplicatively. And then all the results of all these nonlinear combinations in the dendritic tree is what results in a spike. Another theme we see in neurocomputation is recurrence. So these neurons are connected in recurrent circuits, and the dynamics of these circuits are very much part of how brains compute. There's many other things we know about brains, how brains compute. And for that, I just want to steer you, well, I probably don't get to steer most of the people in this room to this book, because Peter Sterling is your colleague here at University of Pennsylvania. But it's just a really marvelous book. It's actually Vijay Balasubramanian who pointed this book out to me when I last visited here in 2017, when this is a new book and it just came out. And I've been studying the book ever since, and it's been really a source of inspiration to me in learning about these very detailed biophysical mechanisms that evolution has designed in order to make neurons do very sophisticated things. A lot of this book is not so much about computation, but about signaling. But it's about how they do this signaling at high signal to noise, but yet under very low energy constraints, under very low size constraints, and how biology plays with these trade-offs of size, of volume, of speed, and so forth, in order to achieve what it needs to in terms of being able to convey signals from one neuron to another. So I'll just sort of I want to point you to that, because I sort of think of this book as a double E's guide, an electrical engineer's guide, or to how the brain works, okay? To designing neural circuits. These are the kind of things we have to think about, not just perceptrons. Okay, so what's the problem? Let's just think about the problem that we need to solve mathematically. So going back to that problem of the letter in how it's projected onto the retina, what does sort of that look like mathematically? And let's just consider a letter just sort of being projected here onto an array of sensors. Let's say here just a 10 by 10 array of sensors. So at any given point in time, this letter we can think of as a point in a 100-dimensional space, where each dimension is one of these pixel values. So that letter right now is a point in a 100-dimensional space. And as it moves to a different location on the retina, that corresponds to yet another point in a 100-dimensional space. Okay, and so now the interesting thing to ask is, well, what does it look like as it moves, as the letter moves across this array, what does that look like in this 100-dimensional space? And so this letter, this sort of halfway in between, does that lie sort of halfway between these points? Well, we know it definitely doesn't. It lies on a point that's off that line. And we know that has to be the case because if it lied straight on this line, that would simply correspond to a linear superposition of that pattern and that pattern. Okay, and so that sort of tells us right there that, of course, what has to be happening as this letter moves across the retina is that in this 100-dimensional space, which sort of any downstream set of neurons is confronted with having to sort of process this information, what's happening is that that point is moving along a nonlinear manifold in the space. We can say more about this nonlinear manifold, which is that to get from one point to another point on this manifold, we can multiply by a matrix. And the matrix that we multiply by to move it along this manifold, is commonly referred to as the transport operator. And moreover, to move from this point here to different points along this manifold, you would multiply by a different matrix. Okay, so the matrix you multiply to go from here to here would be different than the matrix you multiply by to go from here to here. Okay, but the beautiful thing about it is that all these matrices that you use to move along to different points along the manifold belong to a group. And in fact, it's a special kind of group called a Lie group, named for Sophus Lie, who first described these about 100 years ago. And it's parameterized simply here as a matrix exponential. Okay, so we can parameterize that matrix and the other beautiful thing about it is one matrix A that specifies all these matrices, and it's the exponent that matrix in the exponent. So it's the matrix exponential here, e to the as. And so the one-dimensional parameter s is what tells us, how far along you're moving along the manifold. Okay, so that moves you along. So that's the structure of these operators that we need if you were receiving this information downstream in a set of downstream neurons. This is what you would need to know to interpret what's happening here in the data. Okay, so the other thing that's neat about this is that this is the manifold that you move along if you're moving an E along the retina. But now if there's a different shape moving along the retina, you're moving along a different manifold in this space. But this transport operator is exactly the same. So it's the same matrix A that moves you along these different manifolds, irrespective of what the letter is. So what that suggests is that we can sort of think of this then as a factorization problem. If we want to know what's going on in the world, what we want to do is take the data that's coming in at any point in time and factorize it into two things. One is the transport operator, which is, how did I move along the manifold? Where is it along the manifold? And the other one is, which manifold am I on? Okay, so this part here is just telling you which manifold you're on. In this case, it's sort of the initial point here, but it could be any point along here, right? So this one of these things tells you which manifold you're on, and the other thing tells you where you are on the manifold. Okay, so that's fundamentally, mathematically, that is a factorization. We have to take this vector here and factorize it in terms of this matrix and this vector here. Okay, so that's the problem we're going to be thinking about how to solve. One question we have is, well, how to solve the factorization problem. So we'll talk about that, efficient ways of solving that neuronally in neuronal circuits. The other is how to learn these structures. So what if I just hand you a bunch of data of sort of letters moving around or things moving along these manifolds in the space? If I just hand you all this data, could you learn this matrix A, and could you learn sort of a dictionary of the different shapes in that world? And then finally, I'll get you a second. And finally, I just want to mention describe a remarkably efficient way of using residue number systems to represent the equivariant part. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, question. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Just to get oriented, could you help describe similarities and differences between what you're describing here and applying, say, the appropriate phase shift to the Fourier transform of your signal there?
For the case of shift, that's exactly what it is. We'll see that in a second. Yeah. And so you'll see that in a second. Yeah.
as long as we interrupted you. If given the scale, it seems that there's a tremendous amount of discretization in space and I guess time. And wouldn't that muddy up your beautiful continuous Lie group approximation of what's going on, or should we not worry about that?
I don't think we need to worry about that. So yes, the sensors are discrete, right? They have discrete positions. And so we're incorporating that. That's what creates the vector.
Centers are space. There's a pitch problem with respect to that little tiny E, right?
Okay, I didn't render it as a cartoon. I should have rendered it a little bit. It's almost that small. I mean, it's not. I mean, when you read those letters, the 2020 letters in the Snellen eye chart, they're subtending about 4 cones. Okay, so yeah, they're kind of, you know, sometimes the letter is going to fall between the cones, sometimes on the cones. It's kind of at that level almost. Yeah, it's kind of yeah. Is that okay? Okay, so all right, but time, I guess I'm going to argue that the time it's continuous in the world, and it's going to be continuous in the brain, right? The brain does not work as a discrete time system. Computers do, but as far as we know, brains don't. They emit action potentials at certain points in time, but they could be anywhere on a time continuum. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about these 3 aspects. You know, I want to tell you something about these 3 different parts of this. The learning, which is this work of Hoyun Chao, Yubei Chen, and Frank Shi, who is a student from statistics in the lab. And then this problem of factorization, which is a circuit we refer to as a resonator network, which was developed by Paxson Frady. So this is a paper that recently came out in Nature Machine Intelligence. And then finally, I want to tell you about this very efficient way of representing the equivariant part using residue number systems, which gives us some insight, I think, into what the grid cell system is doing in the entorhinal cortex. And this is the work of Chris Kim, a student who in the lab. So yeah, okay, this is what those different parts are. Okay, so let's just get into it here. So first of all, the learning. Okay, so we want to think about now, again, this early days, we're just sort of looking at toy domain of like simple 2-dimensional shapes on the retina. Ultimately, we'd like to think about, 3-dimensional shapes in the world and those projections and the group operators that do that. And so there's some other progress on that I've been working on together with Chris Rozelle and his student Marissa Connor, and that work just came out in Neurocomputation. So I just want to mention as a side, that's sort of somewhere we'd like to go more, but for now, a lot of what you're going to be seeing is sort of like simple sort of 2-dimensional shapes and things like this on the retina. So here we could look at something like the MNIST data set. And typically the way the MNIST data set is treated is just like, well, I want to classify the digit. But there's another problem going on here, which is to estimate the transformation. So you can think of the whole 60,000 digit data set in MNIST is really a product space. It's a product of 2 underlying things. One is the shape or the category of which digit is there. Okay, something about that, there's sort of a canonical shape that's contributing to these different data points, and then a transformation being applied to them, all right? And so the problem, again, fundamentally is given one of these shapes, we want to factorize it into a transformation times a model of the shape, okay? And so now the question is, for something like MNIST, if I just throw you all this data, could you identify the group action that creates these transformations, and could you identify the shapes from it? And the answer is yes, you can with the proper mathematical framework. And so the way we approach this is by describing the data in terms of using a generative model. Okay, so the generative model is very simple, like I just said, is saying what if I give you a data vector, just think of this as a vector of rastering out the pixels in the image. Then I want to describe it as a matrix times a vector representing the shape. And the way we're going to parameterize the shape is using a sparse coding model. So we're just going to learn some dictionary of shapes weighted by coefficients alpha. And the way we're going to specify the transformation, as you just saw, is in terms of a Lie group operator, in terms of this matrix exponential. And so that matrix exponential sort of hides actually a lot of complexity, and we can make it simpler by diagonalizing the matrix A in this form. And so now this thing in the middle is a diagonal, sigma is a diagonal matrix. And so now that's just going to be a diagonal matrix or this when we it has only imaginary parts, because so the groups we're going to restrict ourselves to are the SO2 group. And so the diagonal elements only have imaginary parts. And so when you exponentiate those, they become phasors. Okay, so this matrix in the middle here is just a diagonal matrix whose elements are just complex phasors. All right, and so then at the end of the day, this ends up being the generative model that we're going to try to optimize. Is we're saying the data is the product of a transformation, and the transformation is parameterized by these matrices W, so that's what we need to learn, and then also the shapes, these dictionary of shapes. And the inference problem is given any particular data point, and if I've already learned W and phi, then I need to factorize it out in terms of where am I on the manifold, and which manifold am I on? Okay, so we're going to first do that here for a very simple test case where we have data where we know the ground truth. Okay, so known set of shapes and a known set of transformations. In this case, your question about the Fourier transform. So we know if the action here is just simply two-dimensional shift, then the irreducible representation of that group is the Fourier transform. Okay, so the network didn't know that. We didn't sort of give it the Fourier transform. It just said, well, you can learn any orthonormal matrix you want. What do you need to learn in order to factorize this problem? And it learns the Fourier transform. Okay, we didn't show it these digits moving along the manifold. We're just showing it static snapshots of things along these different manifolds. And it's sort of figuring out, it has enough density of data points along these manifolds to be able to figure out, okay, there's something here that I can connect together by a group, and there's something here I can connect together by a group, and so forth. So it learns the Fourier transform for that matrix W, and then it learns a set of shapes from the data. And these are just shows some examples of now generating data from the model once it's learned. And then if we train it on digits that are now rotating and scaling, then it learns not a Fourier transform, but basically you could sort of think about this as a Fourier transform in log polar coordinates. So that's what you would need for scaling and rotating things. And so now it again learns a sort of a set of canonical digits, and then now it's learned these two different ways that sort of when we generate from the model, it can generate different rotations and different scalings of these shapes. Okay, and so those are cases where we know what the answer is. It can find the answer, so that's encouraging. And so now here's a case where we don't know where the right answer is. We might imagine what it could be in the full MNIST data set. And what it sort of pulls out are these two different transformations, one that sort of a horizontal squeezing or dilation operator, and the other is a shearing or slant operator in the other direction. So these are two different directions that pulled out, and then a set of canonical set of digits, okay? And you'll notice the 0 is repeated twice, and this is kind of shows sort of an odd degeneracy in the model because one of these zeros is being used, the way it creates a 1 is by, and you'll notice there's no 1 here. So the way it creates a 1 is by taking the 0 and squeezing it, okay? So it figured out sort of a strange solution to it, but otherwise it's doing something very reasonable. Okay, so this is kind of encouraging. And I think the lesson from this is that, I'm just going to back up and just show the, to the form of the model here again, is that, I'm sorry, went too fast. Okay, so given the right form of the generative model, if we sort of pose the problem the right way mathematically, if we give the system the right computational primitives to work with, in this case, it's really simply just a bilinear model that I say the data is a product of two things, that's enough to be able to properly learn the structure of this space. Okay, so giving it the right mathematical structure could be a key to making this learning efficient. Okay, so what about the factorization problem? So that was just about learning. How do I solve this problem of given a data point, factorizing it in terms of these two different things? Yeah. Please, yeah, go ahead, yeah. Question. Beautiful. I'll show an example in a second. You can handle the cases where like there's multiple objects in a scene undergoing different transformations, and basically the answer is going to be you kind of have to serialize it. I mean, if you only have sort of one processor looking at the scene, then you have to serialize it, or you could maybe have something like multi-headed attention kind of thing where you could, different processors could sort of attend to different parts of the scene simultaneously. But yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So okay. Yeah, please.
When some orbits begin at time zero, some begin
Yes.
at time.
Yes.
You need some more regularization on W and P, right?
Well, if I showed you, if everything I showed you was always at one part of the orbit, right, then it's going to probably just get that part of the orbit, right? But if some of the things I show you are this part of the orbit, some of the things are this part of the orbit, and so forth, then that turns out to be enough. Yeah, you're right. Okay. I see. Sort of like there's different anchor points you could place, and that would sort of I have to think about that. But we have cases where we've shown that definitely, and this is one of the advantages of this framework, you don't have to exhaustively show it every possible shape in every possible transformation. Okay, once you've shown it enough diversity of things in different poses, then it's learned the transformation. And now when you show it something new it's never seen before, you don't have to show it in all these different poses. And this is really not really, again, one of the main points here, and main advantages is in separating these two. Yeah. Yeah, question. Yeah.
When you have a bilinear model, but you've got that's a fairly intricate model, is it hard to train, or is it easy for you to get your parameters to converge?
I would say students may disagree with me. It didn't take a whole lot of tweaking to train. It worked pretty quickly. So it's using, I didn't get into the nuts and bolts, but it's using expectation maximization to do the training. We just sort of, there's an inner loop where you find sort of the maximum posterior of those estimates for the shape and the transformation, and then an outer loop where you adapt the parameters. So it is kind of mathematically involved. I think there's ways to simplify it, but it didn't take a whole lot of tweaking, I think, to get it to do this. Yeah. Okay, so let me just talk about the factorization problem, because it's a very computationally challenging problem to solve. And the neat thing is there's a very efficient neural solution to that. So the first point is I want to sort of mention that this problem we've just been going through, I posed it as factorizing in terms of the bilinear model, a matrix apart from a vector, the transformation matrix and the vector representing the sort of the canonical shape. But we can actually pose this problem in terms of vector factorization instead of matrix vector. It's just really vector factorization. And the way we can do that is by simply manipulating this expression, multiplying both sides by W transpose, and just sort of redefining some terms. So there's W times the phi, and then we can see that this matrix of the data in a transformed space, we can sort of think of that now as a product, a Hadamard product. So this symbol here just refers to element-wise product, so not inner product between two vectors, but we're just multiplying the vectors together element-wise, and the result is another vector of the same dimensionality. A product of an equivariant part representing the transformation and the invariant part. Okay, and so the important point to mention here is that when you look at this form of the optimization, it sort of leads you to the idea of maybe I could solve for it using gradient descent. I could sort of make an objective function, which is something like this minus this, and then minimize that with respect to S and alpha. But the problem is this parameter S, which is sort of where I am along the manifold, has a lot of local minima in the space. Okay, and so this is just illustrating that if you sort of change S here and in this objective function I just mentioned, then you see all this sort of wobbly behavior. So if you start here, you're going to sort of end up there, and where you want to be is there. And so it turns out that doesn't work. And so we need to think about another way of doing this. And what I'm going to propose here is that we optimize over this entire vector S. Okay, so we optimize over over the entire vector Z. Okay, over the full dimensionality of the Z space. And so the way we do that is by, we build an attractor neural network that forces it to lie on a torus. And the reason why it's on a torus is because I mentioned before that vector Z is a vector of complex phasors. I'm sorry, this form here. And so the way to sort of think about this, it has these different coefficients, these different theta values in the exponent. And so if I plug in different values of x, then each of these phasors is processing around the unit circle. And so that's what's being shown here, right? So if I advance the value of x, then this is going to move, the first dimension along this circle, the second dimension along this circle, and they'll move at different rates. They'll process at different rates depending on those values of theta 1 and theta 2. Okay, so jointly, these two circles together constitute a torus. Okay, so as you advance the value of x, so x is a single scalar, then what you're doing as you increase x, you're sort of wrapping around the surface of this torus. In this case, it's a torus in n dimensions. Okay, so it's an n-dimensional torus. So that's the structure of this equivariant part that we want to optimize, that we want to sort of factorize out of the data. And so the way we're going to enforce that it lies on a manifold on the torus is by an attractor neural network that enforces that it lies in the manifold. And so you can formulate an energy function for this system, and which keeps it on the manifold. And then the dynamics that do that are just shown here. So you can you basically form a dictionary of different points along the manifold that you want it to, of the equivariant part that you want it to lie on. And then just by taking it at each point in time, your current z state, projecting it onto this dictionary D, and then multiplying by projecting it back out into the z space, and then normalizing. And all this does is normalize it to unit amplitude. So it's always a unit amplitude phasor. Okay, so those dynamics will keep it on the manifold. And this is just to mention that this is kind of like a Hopfield network. And it's a sort of a generalization of Hopfield networks to phasors, to complex phasors, which was described by Nost in the 80s. Okay, so we can have the dynamics on these phasors that keeps it on the manifold. And so now what we can do is try to find, for example, given a vector B, which is a product of two vectors, okay, one of these vectors comes from this dictionary of possible z's, and the other vector comes from this dictionary of possible z's. So one of these might correspond to the position of the object, the other might correspond to the shape of the object, so it'd be sort of a discrete dictionary. It wouldn't necessarily lie on a torus. But for now, the problem is that given a vector B, which is a product of this vector and this vector, figure out what those factors are, okay? So the constraint is that whatever I choose for these two vectors, this one has to come from this dictionary of possible vectors, and this one has to come from this dictionary here. Okay, so in general, factorization problems such as this are hard problems. They're sort of in the class of combinatoric optimization problems. But here, there's a very efficient solution to this, where since we're optimizing over essentially a very low dimensional manifold in this high dimensional space, we can make an initial estimate for that z vector that is just simply a superposition of all the possible choices. Okay, so let's just say this one here, we're just going to add all these ones together, and that's our initial estimate of this is the superposition of those. And so now it might stand to reason that a good initial estimate for z1 would be to take this vector b and divide it by our estimate for z2. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. It's a complex conjugate, and that's how we end up dividing with phasors, right? So what this gives us is a superposition of all the possible estimates of z1. One of the elements of this superposition is the right answer. Okay, the other ones are not the right answer. Okay, and so what we're going to rely upon here is the fact that a lot of these, the ones that aren't the right answer, are going to add destructively. And the one that is the right answer is going to match one of the elements of our code book of these known vectors. Okay, so we're going to get a strong inner product when we multiply this estimate by this matrix D1. We're going to get a strong inner product for the one that is the right answer, and the other ones are going to combine destructively. Okay, so we can essentially, what we're doing here is a kind of search and superposition that is afforded by being in a high dimensional space of exploring these different solutions. Okay, and then so that's how this resonator network works, the logic behind it. So we get the estimate of Z1 by projecting this superposition onto the dictionary D1. And then from that estimate for Z1, we plug that in here and use that to re-estimate Z2 and so forth, and just an iterative network. And basically you can formulate this as a recurrent neural network. In a way, as a set of Hopfield networks using these complex phasors that are sort of all talking to each other. through these multiplicative interactions. All right, so that's what we call a resonator network. And we've shown, these are papers that we've published previously from the group, that it functions very efficiently in finding solutions to these factorization problems in relatively few iterations, maybe between 25 and 50 iterations or so typically, or even in fewer in many cases. In a search space involving millions of possible answers, millions of possible solutions, it can very quickly hone in on a solution. It's very effective and it basically beats all the methods that you might otherwise be led to in terms of just thinking about standard gradient descent or other standard optimization methods. Okay, so this is just a demonstration of that in action, showing an image here with different, you asked earlier about an image with different characters in it. And so now what we can do is form a vector representing this entire image, which is essentially a multiplicative binding of objects, different object shapes and different positions. And then what it's doing is one at a time, handing to the resonator. And what you're seeing here is the inner product between the estimates for the color, the shape, and the position. You're seeing the inner products between its estimates and the code book of possible answers. Okay, so what it's doing is settling and finding, an estimate of the color, which letter it is, and its position in the scene. Okay, so it's very efficiently searching through this product space of a huge number of possible combinations of colors and shapes and positions, and solving this factorization problem very efficiently. And it's basically doing it with a recurrent neural network that can solve that. Okay, so one last thing then I want to turn to is how to scale this up to a larger range of positions. So maybe just back to this example here. In this image, it was a 50 by 50 image. So the equivariant part that's representing position had to have sort of 50 entries in that matrix for the horizontal and 50 for the vertical dimension. And one of the things we'll see here is that as you increase the number of positions that you want to represent, the number of objects or whatever, the dimensionality is going to scale linearly with the size of your code book. Okay, so that's not going to be good if we want to work over very large dynamic ranges of position. Okay, and then it turns out then there is a remarkably efficient way of dealing with that, which is suggested by the grid cell system. This is going to be a slightly different take on why grid cells in the entorhinal cortex are a good idea than the theory by Vijay Balasubramanian and I'm sorry, forgetting his last name, but Zhuzhen Wei. I'm sorry, Zhuzhen Wei, who was here as a graduate student many years ago. And I was very inspired by their work, actually, early on. But this, I think, is a sort of a different take, which has kind of similar properties to it. Okay, and this idea was initially proposed by E. Lafitte many years ago that these grid cells might be functioning as a residue number system. And so what are we looking at here very briefly for those not familiar with grid cells? These are neurons way up high in the brain in the entorhinal cortex, which represent your location in the world, not like place cells where they only fire in one location, but each grid cell fires in multiple locations as you move around the world. And the locations that any one cell fires in are laid out in a sort of hexagonal grid, a two-dimensional hexagonal grid. So this is the response field of one grid cell. This is of another, this is of another, and so forth. Okay, it's a really astounding finding from neuroscience. And the other most astounding thing perhaps about it is the fact that the scales, the different spacings of these sort of response fields are discrete. So there's a module of neurons that has this spacing, there's another group of neurons that has this spacing, and so forth. So they jump in different sort of discrete scales. And so what E. Lafitte noticed about, initially proposed, I think around the same time, I think, as this paper maybe or so, is that it might be functioning as a residue number system. So what we're going to sort of do is now show how to engineer that idea as a model using this equivariant representation of position using complex phasor vectors. So first of all, what's so great about residue number systems? Well, first of all, what is a residue number system? For those who are not familiar, so basically, it's a way of representing representing a number modulo a set of base numbers. So it's a modulo number system. And so, for example, here you would represent the number 41 with respect to the moduli 3, 5, and 7 as 41 mod 3, which is 2, 41 mod 5, which is 1, and 41 mod 7, which is 6. Okay, so the representation in this case of 41 would be 2, 1, 6. And one of the big advantages of this number system, like a binary system, is that it has exponential scaling, meaning that the dynamic range of numbers you can represent scales as the product of these moduli. Okay, so that's this thing called the Chinese remainder theorem, as long as these moduli, as long as you pick them to be co-prime. So there's a vast degree of flexibility here of how you could pick them to have this property. Okay, so the great thing there is that now I can describe a number over a very large dynamic range by combining numbers, a set of numbers over much smaller dynamic ranges. Okay, so that's the key idea we're going to tap into. The other super convenient and useful property of them for our purposes here is the fact that their arithmetic is carry-free in this system. So if you want to add two residue numbers, then their residue number representation simply adds element-wise, and there's no carry operation. So for example, here you would just add 6 and 5, and the answer is 11, but then 11 mod 7 is 4, and you just leave it at that. You don't have to worry about the carry bit, and you're going to have a unique representation of the sum up until this scaling limit here. Okay, so that's what we're going to tap into here. So how do you make a vector Z, for example? How do you now constrain it so that it has this modulo property, so that it kind of wraps around? So we can construct these vectors so that their similarity kernel has this modulo property, so it repeats. For example, this kernel here has repeats mod 7. Okay, so so that's and the way you do that is by picking the phases, those phasor coefficients, theta, to be the discrete use of unity. So if you want it to be mod 7, then you choose the phases to be discrete on this unit circle. In this case, 7 even subdivisions, or the 7th roots of unity, or the 5th roots of unity, and so forth, depending on what your moduli is. Okay, so this vector now will have the property that as we increase the value of x, that it will create vectors initially that are different, but once we reach 7, then it will wrap around to be the same, and so forth, just keep on going. So it has that modulo property that we desire. Okay, so then what we can now do is represent the number that we want to the number that we want to represent by simply binding these vectors together from the different moduli. So we can take one vector from that's representing the number mod 3, another number that's a vector that's representing the number mod 5, and another that's representing at mod 7, and simply multiply those together element-wise. Okay, this is now an element-wise product of these 3 vectors, which uniquely represents any number along this dynamic range from 0 to 104. Okay, so that's how we're going to propose then breaking up this dynamic range, is by having associative memories essentially for very much smaller code books, and by combining them together multiplicatively, we can represent something over a much larger dynamic range. So that's the problem of composing a number. Then if I just give you a Z representing some number, the way you decompose it in terms of those residue numbers is again by a resonator network, because we essentially have to factorize it. So let me just go back a slide. Okay, so the problem of if I give you this number here, if I give you this vector representing that number, then in order to figure out each of these Z's, you have to take that and factorize it into these 3. And so we're going to solve that factorization problem by a resonator network. Okay, so what this enables us to do is, first of all, we can represent numbers over a much larger dynamic range. If we just combine them together, this is just showing the exponential scaling that you get by increasing the number of moduli as we sort of go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 and so forth. It's moving you up exponentially in terms of how many numbers you can effectively represent. But the really nice property here is that now the coding range scales superlinearly with the vector dimension. Okay, so otherwise it would have scaled linearly, which is not such good news. But now with sort of a modest addition to the dimensionality, we can get a much stronger boost in terms of dynamic range of distances we can code over. So that's really what the residue number system, this vector representation of the residue number system is affording us. Okay, another beautiful property that comes out of this model is that of robustness. So you might wonder, if I'm representing things with complex phasors with neurons and so forth, how accurately do I need to do that? And their answer is not very accurately. There can be tons of phasor noise in the system, and the way we do this is by adding von Mises noise to the phases in the exponent at different parts of the algorithm. So either in the input or in the update steps or in the code book and so forth. And what this is just showing is that there's sort of a graceful degradation. Then this is actually with a huge amount of noise here, where you're just like plus or minus pi over 2. But up to that point, for sort of, still pretty much large amounts of noise, that it has a very robust performance in being able to still give you to do this accurate representation of position. At this point, I think I should somehow do a time check, but I don't have a clock up here. Does someone have a couple more? Okay, so maybe that's good. So then the final point is how do you then scale this to represent two-dimensional positions? So that was just about representing one number. And if I'm working in 2 dimensions, you might think I need 2 numbers. But it turns out that's not a very efficient way to tile space, because essentially, if you were going to describe, which way are you moving, then if you wanted to do that in a non-negative coordinate system, you would need 4 vectors, like north, south, east, west. But you get a much more efficient tiling of that in a triangular coordinate frame using 3 vectors in what's also called the Mercedes-Benz frame. So in other words, another way to think about this is with fewer bits per coefficient of each of these vectors, you can get a much more accurate representation of space than using the traditional Cartesian north, south, east, west coordinate frame. Okay, so we're going to use residue numbers to encode each of these directions in the space and combine them together. And then you get these grids that sort of have this modulo kind of repetition in 2-dimensional space. And basically, this is what gives us sort of this grid cell kind of property. And we built it in, of course, but we built it in from the principle of trying to efficiently code 2-dimensional space, not because we said, oh, hey, we want to make this look like grid cells in the brain, but this just sort of falls out as a most efficient solution for doing this. Okay, and this is just showing the boost that we get from a triangular coordinate system over just over a regular Cartesian square coordinate system. And I should mention, by the way, that most of the grid cell models you see out there are actually based on what we call oblique coordinate frames, where they're actually taking something that's intrinsically an orthogonal coordinate frame, and they're just sort of skewing it to be trapezoidal, and they're not actually representing it in a triangular coordinate frame. And so this is really sort of capturing it at that ability. And so finally, what we're sort of turning towards is how to use this. And this is one of the things we think this system is really good for, how to use it for path integration. So if I let's go back to that system like the ellipsoid body of the fly, where you're getting different signals that are not indicating which way you're heading, but which way you're moving. Like I just turned the head 10 degrees, or I just moved a few feet or so forth. How could you take those inputs that are representing velocities in different directions? That's this vector here, and then binding it to these residue number system modules in the model, that you can do very efficient path integration. And this path integration is also robust to noise. So you could have noise in these vectors, phasor noise in these vectors coming in, and in the resonator network, and it still performs efficiently. Okay, so just to wrap up, I guess maybe the central message of what I want to try to convey in all this work here is that the underlying framework of this approach is trying to understand the problems that biology solved. And the problems of biology are defined not just by the brain itself, but also by looking at animal behavior. What are animals using vision for? What are they doing? What are the computations they're doing with their brains? And representing where one is in the world, what pose objects are in and so forth is a very important part of the problems that animals what animals need to solve in order to survive in the world. We can form it by biological structure, things that we know that neurons can do, like multiplication by linear interactions of signals, recurrent neural networks competing with dynamics, like these resonator networks and so forth. So it maps onto many of those kinds of structures. And then finally, informing this with the mathematical structure of the problem. So things like Lie groups and using residue number representations are a really central part of being able to design these neural architectures. Okay, well, happy to take questions and also looking forward to chatting with you.
Thank you for the inspiring talk. Very interesting research that you're doing. I was wondering a bit about like the role of this type of research in trying to understand like human cognition or, animal cognition, because it seems that there's this inspiration that is taken, then we use some mathematical tools to solve a problem in a kind of bio-inspired way. And I'm wondering, is this a way to form hypotheses on how the cognition is working? Like, are you then trying to figure out, okay, are we using the Chinese remainder theorem in our brain? Are we using resonator networks to factorize them, et cetera, et cetera? Maybe could you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I guess you summarized it pretty well. Yeah, we're trying to generate hypotheses about what could the brain be doing, right? So even in the case where we have the flight connectome, which is a beautiful example, you have access to every possible neuron anatomically, right? Not physically in that flight connectome. You know its entire wiring diagram. You still have this abyss you're staring into. My God, what is that doing? And there's all kinds of structure there. There's huge amounts of structure, like we see in the grid cells and the entorhinal cortex. So when you see a structure like grid cells, as a theorist, like Vijay and Zhuzhen did, like we're doing, like many other people, like Lafitte, you can't help but say, wow, okay, I think I have an idea. This might be what it's doing, right? So that's a hypothesis. So a mathematical hypothesis, right, informed by what math, from math that it can do. And so that becomes now your hypothesis. And yes, now that we have a working model, and that was a big part of it, is not, just sort of saying this as residue number system is, halfway there. The other part is how do you actually engineer that to get it to work robustly? Okay, so how do I actually form these representations neuronally? What are the computational operations I have to do? Well, these multiplicative interactions are a huge part of it, of getting it to work efficiently. Representing things with phasors seems to be very important. It begs questions now, how does the brain represent phasors? We have some potential answers to that. So for example, the work of Fritz Sommer and Paxton Frady on what they call threshold phasor associated memory, or is basically the idea that you can represent phase by the timing of the spike relative to an ongoing oscillation. So there's many places in the brain where we see these oscillations in abundance, and the timing of the spike relative to the phase of oscillation seems to be very important. It codes information like in the phase precession in the hippocampus, for example. So that's one possibility, right? And so there's a couple of things here, like how do you compute with phasors? How do you do factorization? How do you implement residue number systems in the brain? And this is the beginning of that, so that we can, when we sort of flesh that story out and build it as a neural system, now we have something we can sort of compare to the neuroanatomy, to the neurophysiology, and maybe work together with experimentalists to try to test this more concretely. But that's exactly, I think, the way to think about it. Yeah. Sure.
So my question is on how do you know if you're findings validate real phenomena? So I was looking at the MNIST experiment you're doing, and I was thinking that when we write numbers, first of all, there's some temporal.
Oh yes.
We draw the numbers out, and also while we're drawing, there's parts of the digits that overlap with
yes
digits. So there's some compositional nature.
yes.
So I'm just wondering if you're getting all these findings and models off of the static data sets, Do you know if they'll transfer over to like the real world?
Okay, let's see. Yeah, there are a couple of things in there. Yeah, so first of all, I agree. This is one of my points of really like discomfort of treating these MNIST digits as like images and vectors, right? Because they're generated by, the hand moving. So it'd be more natural to describe it that way and think about that's really what the data is. And so that seems like a more natural way to treat it. Again, I think for us, the MNIST is just kind of like training wheels for getting these things working and proving that they work in certain conditions. But real world would be dealing with real images of the world, right? Of like a three-dimensional object projected onto the two-dimensional image, and from a real camera, but also maybe from a foveated imaging system, not just but from a rectangular sampled array, but from like a foveated camera or something like that. So I think there's a long ways to go from these early days right now of just sort of testing, getting these models to work on these simple kind of test cases to getting out to work on more complex stimuli. But yeah, I'm very hopeful. I think we'll get there and be able to have real world models that. I mean, ultimately, we want to explain biology, right? So we have to do that to make it more realistic. Yeah.
I had a question more generally. What is the role of neuromorphic?
What's the role of what? Okay, there's a couple ways to answer that. Well, so in terms of okay, there's definitely the sensors have noise of various sorts. And so part of the problem the brain solves is to figure out, from those noisy inputs or really incomplete inputs, how to complete the picture. So what's really going on in the world given those sensor measurements. And there are, the noise arises in various sort of parts. And so that's, one problem the brain faces. And I would say that happens in the brain. It doesn't, the denoising part mostly happens there, probably not. A little bit maybe in the periphery, somewhat. But there's another very interesting side to that question, which is how do you exploit noise? Right. And so there's all sorts of natural sources of noise and variability in the brain. And there's lots of interesting work now showing how, for example, you could think of this noise as a way of sampling from probability distributions. So that's part of really doing more optimal inference, is you want to represent a full distribution. And so people like Mate Legno have been proposing these models that use Langevin dynamics. So it's basically doing something like gradient descent. We're doing gradient descent here in some cases, but instead of just descending the gradient only, you just do gradient descent plus noise. And the remarkable thing about that, Langevin dynamics tells you when you do gradient descent plus noise, you are sampling from a posterior distribution, which is exactly what you wanted to do, right? So I think that's another really super exciting direction to explore is, one way that the brain can exploit these the sources of noise internally.
Thanks. Let's thank the speaker again. Next week, we'll have Terry Fong from NASA Ames, same time, same place. Thank you.
Wonderful, Bruno.
Okay,
Thank you
great.
so much.
Yeah.